You're all very welcome. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the source of inspiration from the title of this talk, which is Publish and be Damned. That was the original quotation. And that's what the Duke of Wellington is reputed to have said in 1824, when an attempt was made to blackmail him by the courtesan Harriet Wilson. Ms. Wilson intended to reveal that the Duke of Wellington had been dallying pleasurably in her boudoir on many occasions and submitting to her charms, and that's while being a married man. Such a naked attempt at blackmail was met with the now famous response by the Duke, "Publish and be damned." And as I sat to begin work on this talk today, the quote came to mind: "The consequences of publishing anything is and always has been very relevant to the composer or performer. In recent times, there has been much public attention, both in the media and indeed in the courts, about the effects that free access to global publication has had on the rights of privacy to individuals. A casual accusation or revelation, unmediated by any editorial constraint or legal caution, can quickly go viral on the internet, leading to considerable pain and distress in the lives of the persons being libelled. In the case of the Duke of Wellington, there was at least a clear motive. Harriet Wilson was obviously in the business of extracting some hush money, some Wellington booty, as we might say. Today, such honourable or enterprising motives are often missing. For certain kinds of people, the internet provides a corridor for cowards, where a malign seed can be blown around in the digital crosswinds. It can take root in the fertile long acre on the edges of the information superhighway. It can cross easily over any border. It is subject to neither check nor balance, free, unhindered, and unverified." And so when we speak of publishing, it is essential to distinguish between what is meant historically and what it has come to mean with the arrival of the internet. If we look at the Oxford Dictionary, we see that it defines the verb to publish as to prepare and issue a book, journal, or piece of music for public sale. Now, how quaintly threadbare that antique definition seems today. One conjures up images of songwriters, toiling away in the middle of the night with the last line of a lyric, editors checking texts into the small hours, printing presses whirring and clacking through the night, newsboys, booksellers, and record stores stocking up their shelves in anticipation of the arrival of those eager customers, breathless with cash and fist. Golden days, perhaps, but no more. Publishing today can be as simple as pressing the upload button, and away into the great Tower of Babylon will fly the next maybe 50 Shades of Grey, which, by the way, sold more than all of the Harry Potter books put together. Is this a good thing? Well, we'll see. Before I continue, and lest I'm beginning to sound like a sentimentalist here, let me assure you that I am completely enthralled to the technology and all its enticements. From the earliest days in both my professional and personal life, I was exhilarated by the possibilities of the new digital technology, and I would have been among the first of my colleagues to use the internet as a means of transmitting music, both written and recorded. Sometimes, when away from my screen and my mouse, I feel that hollow ache that can only be satisfied by hitting the start button and hearing that comfortable chord announcing the welcoming logo, that first draw on a morning cigarette, the ruby rush that follows a mouthful of red wine. I had considered a 12-step program for techno addicts, but being digital, I think they only do 10-step programs. However, at the risk of being seen as anti-innovation and a curmudgeonly old fart, I would like to draw attention to some of the cultural cautions that have appeared to me since I bought my first Mac SE in the mid-1980s. That was nearly 30 years ago, and I can still recall the excitement when I took it out of the box. If I may, I would like to bring you back to my early life as a musician in Dublin. Somewhere in the mid-1970s, I began to get work as a session player. In those days, recording sessions were quite structured affairs. They started sharply at 10 in the morning, well, unless Barney was involved, and they went on, and you were paid, I think, £9 for a 20-minute, with a 20-minute break for a 3-hour session. What was notable about those sessions was that we all sat down together in the studio. and linked together by headphones. And we played together in real time until we got an acceptable take. Occasionally, while the engineer was working on some individual sounds in the control room, one or other of us would start playing a riff, let's say, more often or not with no connection to the work in hand, and the whole band would gradually join in, jamming happily until the producer or the MD reminded us what we were there to do in the first place. The importance of these spontaneous outbursts of musical expression was not that any sparkling gems of spontaneous creativity were lost forever, although maybe it did happen once or twice. What was important was that we were experiencing the joys of impromptu music making and the essential thrill of listening to each other and responding creatively to what we were hearing. Moments such as these were acknowledged by winks and smiles among the players, and I'd gladly have handed back my session fee anytime, well, nearly, in exchange for this kind of transport. But let me fast forward a tad to the late 1970s and early 80s and the arrival of digital technology into the recording studio. The control room, normally the sanctuary and preserve of engineers and producers, began to be flooded with all kinds of gizmos, doohickeys, and thingamybobs. The synthesizer and the sampler took place of the Fender Rhodes piano and the piano. No self-respecting studio worth its salt was without a tower of flight cases cluttering up the control room and filled with all kinds of magical swagers, stramblers, and flangers. Prince among these invading armies was the drum machine. It's now a matter of some embarrassment to me and a source of considerable regret when I consider the hours spent crouched over the endless manuals that were now part of our daily literary intake. We could now program and have Phil Collins' snare drum and tom-toms on our fingertips. No more setting up of rickety drum kits with all their eccentric clicks and squeaks and noises. No more gaffer tape on drum heads and cushions shoved into bass drums. No more tedious microphone placements and endless sound checks with taciturn drummers hung over from a late-night gig the previous night and wishing they were elsewhere. As well as this, the notion of the 3-hour session went out the window, and players were brought in one by one and on different days to record their performances on the same song. For the studio and the engineer and the studio owner particularly, this was great news. A 4-minute song, instead of taking a few hours to record, could now stretch itself into days and days as the various composite parts were added individually. Full disclosure here, I did all of this myself on many occasions. Often it was very convenient for reasons of the availability of players or even for geographical considerations. I recall doing the score for one film where I began the track in Galway. Then I added the Monks of Glenstal in Glenstal, an orchestra in London, a choir in New York, Charlotte Church in London, and mixed it all back in Galway. Of course, this would have been very difficult in the old days to assemble all this in one place. But the engineer and I were able to travel between all these locations with just a hard drive and a Mac. Another big plus was that this kind of modular recording afforded was the ability to really focus on each individual musician and performer. Not only that, but as digital technology improved, we were able to record many performances from the same musicians and then choose what we thought were the best bits later. Before the arrival of digital technology, this would have been so painstaking as to be virtually impossible. Editing with a razor blade on thin magnetic tape was a completely different kettle of fish than cutting and pasting with a mouse. And in the great post-operative surgery that the studio had become, we are now able to get singers into tune, on the beat, with exquisite dynamics, without having to put them to the bother of doing it themselves on the day of the recording. From the perspective of pure sound recording, much of what has happened since the arrival of digital is very positive. And while the purists will still hanker for the warmth of analog and the authenticity of vinyl, in my view, there is no turning back. Any of the criticisms aimed at digital, and particularly the need to compress the audio down for the internet to friendly MP3s, will in time disappear as cloud computing and other innovations advance, as they undoubtedly will. So what did happen on the negative side? I will return to the question in greater detail in a moment, but let me say this. I think we have less of a community of musicians and performers than we did before it arrived. The ability of composers to work on their own with their Macs and their PCs has made for a more socially fractured working environment. If I was the guitarist overdubbing onto a track that already had a keyboard player from the previous day and a drummer from a week before that and a bass player, would I really need to know their names? Do I ever need to meet them? Will I miss the buzz of interacting with other players, swapping and bouncing ideas back and forth? Will I miss that transcendent sense of musical companionship that infuses any group or ensemble when they know they've got it right together? Well, I suppose if I'd never had it, I wouldn't miss it. But it is my belief that musical life is somehow the poorer without it. And let me return to the title at the top of the page, Publish and Perish. Why should our young creator pause before pressing that upload button and unleashing his work into the world? We have seen that digital technology has allowed our performers and composers to create complete master recordings in their homes or attics for a fraction of the cost that it might have taken 20 years ago. Not only that, but they will have their song in a format that can immediately be published on the internet. So why wait? The world is out there, just a click away. Well, there are a few problems. The first one has been well noted over recent years, but the debate still rages. For our purposes here today, it's worth summarizing who the main protagonists are. On the one side are the creators, those whose work can be made available over the internet, be they musical, literary, visual, or whatever. These creations are commonly known as intellectual property, as we know, or rather less satisfactorily as content. All of this material has traditionally been protected by copyright, but as the internet developed, it became apparent that copyright was being infringed at an alarming rate by a process known as file sharing, employed most notoriously by an internet service called Napster. Now, Napster became incredibly popular. It had 26 million users. Surprise, surprise. Free music turned out to be popular. Who ever thought of that? Anyway, after a few years and some terminal damage to the old model of the music industry, Napster found it in the courts and it was finally wound up. The forceful reaction of the record industry to the flagrant abuse of copyright rose the hackles of the other protagonists in the argument, who were many and varied, but can be loosely referred to as the Creative Commons. This group, filled with a liberal smattering of intellectuals and academics, argued that any control of the internet amounted to an attack on free speech and civil liberty. There is much to applaud at some of the arguments put forward by this group, but it fundamentally confused two separate rights, the public right to free speech and the private right to earn a living from your work. Somehow it saw these two rights as being in conflict with each other, when in fact they're quite complementary and should happily live side by side. I recall at the height of the controversy listening to a discussion on BBC 4, where a prominent academic was waxing eloquent about the new era of freedom that was dawning upon us. We are, she announced, in the era of sharing. All very well until I come around to share her car or her wine collection. This viewpoint is most often voiced by the people who are so removed from the lives of performers that they have no idea what it is like to depend on a royalty check to contribute towards next month's bills. There is an essential link between the author's work and his or her livelihood that, if broken, leaves him with little option but to look elsewhere for a living. The result is an industry which will ultimately be largely amateur because it is expected to rely on a market which has no currency. So looking at our young man or woman at the gateway of Babylon, what are they to do? Publish and perish, or don't publish and perish? And anyway, how does all this link into creativity? I have sat at conferences and debates about this whole issue over the last 10 years, and I've been astonished to hear what some people have been saying in order to convince young creators to unhitch themselves from any attachment to copyright, to let their work breathe freely into the great wide world. The simpler of these arguments goes something like this. 1, give away your music free, and as a result, 2, attract a large fan base. 3, earn lots of money from your new fans. Well, this cheese and the mousetrap idea is not only a little smelly, but it's completely impractical. If your fan base has been educated not to pay for your music, well then, good luck with introducing them to the idea later. The second version of this is similar but more complex. 1, give away your music for free, and as a result, 2, attract a large fan base. 3, earn lots of money from other activities like advertising and merchandising and tour promotion. I have heard this one been touted extensively and mostly by that other group of protagonists in the argument, the ISPs, or the Internet Service Providers. These slightly more opaque figures are not only organizations who are making billions from the Internet, but they also benefit enormously from keeping the whole situation unregulated and chaotic. It is no accident that they spend millions on lobbying politicians around the world. In our little country, there is a fear amongst our leaders that any attempt to regulate the Internet will result in stifling innovation and the loss of jobs. Oh, horror. Translated, this means that the multinationals will move their operations elsewhere. They'll do that anyway. When they find a cheaper location, of course. Loyalty to place is not high on the lists of multinational corporations. What is essentially flawed about all this kind of thinking is that it removes the creators further and further from what is the real source of their livelihood, their copyright. You put your music up on YouTube, instead of being paid on the basis of the value of that music to the listener, you might be recompensed from the enormous advertising revenue that the ISPs earn every year. In effect, all creative content becomes like a kind of massive conglomerated advertising jingle to attract consumers. Once again, the giant corporate hand moves everywhere. It is my belief that the corporate invasion of our cultural lives, in our sport, in our music, at virtually every public gathering or pastime, has become so pervasive and intrusive that the pure enjoyment of any event is now ultimately impossible. Our stadiums and concert halls are all being named after commercial products. When Riverdance plays in London, originally, the show normally appeared at what used to be called the Hammersmith Odeon. Since we began performing there years ago, it has been renamed several times, mostly after different kinds of beer. Soon, even the bands will be named after products. Where are you going tonight? I'm going off to hear the Pedigree Chums. Ah. And where are they playing? Oh, they're at the Dolce & Gabbana Music Hall. Oh, is Dizzy Domestos on the bass? Of course. And the Kentucky Fried Chickens are the backing singers. Cool, I'll be there. One of the most common phrases that is bandied about in the conferences about music on the internet is the one that tells young artists that they can get rid of the man. Now, getting rid of the man is shorthand for removing all of the intermediaries that traditionally have been interposed between performers and their audiences. So in this rogues gallery, we would have found record companies, radio stations, music publishers, managers, agents, promoters, distributors, record stores, producers, collection agencies, IMRO, and anyone else that could benefit from the career of the artist. With the new personal freedoms afforded to the internet, most, if not all of these, could be dispensed with, and the creator could now have a direct line to his audience. My own relationship with some members of that rogues gallery has varied over the years, and I never thought that I would see myself standing up to defend some of them. But my recent experience has caused me to use a wider lens when viewing the roles that many of these folks fulfilled. However, rather than eulogizing about the great music business managers and record companies, executives and radio stations that we've seen, I would prefer to look at this from the point of view of an artist and their creative career. A few years ago, I became aware of a young songwriter and performer. He was doing exceptional work and was creating quite a stir with the quality of his songs and the uniqueness of his live performances. I met with him a few times and we discussed his music and his plans. He was very au fait with the new technology and was fired up with an entrepreneurial spirit. He had been overwhelmingly convinced that he could do much of what his career required on his own. Not for reasons of greed, but because he thought that rather than pay someone to do it badly, he could do it much better himself. There was a time when such notions could have been entertained by any. There was a time when such notions could not have been entertained by any artist. But the internet, with its promise of getting rid of the man, made this a beguiling and attractive idea. And if there was anyone who could multitask, it was this guy. He could certainly sing and write. Recording was no problem for him, and he was a multi-instrumentalist, so he could play most of the instruments required for his songs. He was a wizard on the web and knew how to design his own web page. He was Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and all the social networks were second nature to him, and he could reply to the queries of his fan base while watching television or having his breakfast cereal. He managed to find a way via the internet to most of the venues suitable to his kind of music, and pretty soon he was able to book his own tours. I know that he was also designing his own merchandising and an app for the iPad when I lost contact with him for quite a while. A couple of years later, I heard a new song of his on the radio. What immediately struck me was how little his music had progressed in the intervening years. And then I could not help but think, what should I expect? He was doing the work of 10 people, and surely some part of him was going to suffer. Unfortunately, at the moment it would seem that his musical progression has been halted, and in all the frenetic activity of his self-animated career, some promising part of his creative expression has been put into cold storage. I have no problem with the idea of looking after as much of your career as you can. The internet is an ideal way to introduce yourself to a wider market, and who knows, you may start hearing from fans in Madagascar or Bulawayo who have found their way to your music on the web. However, a writer is a writer, a performer is a performer, and for most people who do it, it's a full-time job. If Van Morrison had to design his own T-shirts and update his webpage every day, I don't think we would have had Moondance or Prince's Purple Rain or any of these things. The danger of getting rid of the man is that you run the risk of becoming the man. And let us not forget that for performers, managers, or producers, they can have an important role in the similar way that publishers and editors can have for authors. Bringing a new piece of writing into the world can be a tentative and insecure activity full of doubts and hesitations. To have a trusted sounding board as part of your team is an invaluable asset, not only to encourage you when you need that extra spur close to the finishing line, but also to get you moving if you are in one of those doldrums that can often affect the creative classes. And it seems idle to speculate what the Beatles' albums might have been like without the man, George Martin, to mediate and interpret what the band was trying to achieve, or the other man who managed them. Also, I have never met a writer who can negotiate sensibly about his or her own work. They're too close to it. They either think too much of it or too little of it, or generally make a fool of themselves when representing their work in a commercial context. This is where the man comes in, and a good man in that position can be an essential part of any artist's armory. Let's leave the word of artists for the moment, with their dilemmas of whether or not to publish or perish, or how to have their voices heard in the babel of the internet. I would like to turn to ourselves here today, far more interesting, and reflect on our relationship to music within a culture that has now had digital technology and the internet for a couple of decades. If I may, I'll get anecdotal again. When I was in my teens, I saw an ad in the back of the Melody Maker or the New Musical Express for a club in England called the Heener Record Centre. I sent away for an application form and joined the club. Every week, I received a catalogue of all the new albums, together with a list of the upcoming releases, which I could pre-order. It was May 1967, and there it was in black and white, the long-promised Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I immediately sent on my 21 shillings, if I recall correctly, and waited for the release date. To my delight and absolute amazement, I received the album a week at least before it appeared in the shops in Limerick. Now, you've no idea what this meant. If I had run for mayor, I would have been immediately elected in Limerick. It would have been a landslide. Girls who wouldn't give me the time of day were now falling into step beside me as I strode the streets of Limerick like a colossus with my vinyl treasure under my arm and the four mustachioed faces of my heroes on the cover smiling benignly out at the envious people of Limerick. After school each day, a group of about 10 of us would gather in the house of Billy Sinden. Now, his father had a magnificent stereo system, and for the next few hours, and indeed on the many nights into the summer holidays of 1967, that vinyl treasure and others would be the subject of endless analysis, scrutiny, and discussion. Tracks would be played and replayed at various speeds and backwards and we rummaged between the grooves for further insights into what we had all sensed that this was a massive milestone in the history of popular music. I had learned by ear the accompaniment to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which I swapped for the harpsichord part that my pal Peter Hearn had learned for fixing a hole. Things were no longer bad or good, they were now glossy and fab. A few of us had acquired granny sunglasses, which we wore on the tips of our noses, along which we could peer superciliously like John Lennon at those outside in our elite world. But granny glasses and Liverpudlian linguistics aside, mostly it was the music that moved us. Beautifully sung and played, its scope scanned the Pythoness world of Mr. Kite, the isolation and loneliness of She's Leaving Home, the exotic Eastern spirituality of Within You, Without You, and the anthemic hippie bonhomie of A Little Help from My Friends. It was our music. It defined us, and we enjoyed it together. We went on to listen voraciously to Pink Floyd, The Wall, or Simon Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. We sat in groups in bedsits and turned up the volume as loud as the neighbours could endure it. And we went to the beach with guitars and sang You've Got a Friend, or later on in our local pub bellowed the chorus of Hey Jude to drown out the barman calling for time. Gentlemen, please. Mostly, it was a community experience. And the first lie la lie of the chorus of The Boxer was all it took to turn a room of apparent strangers into something like a close-knit gathering of long-lost friends. So what happened? Well, a large meteor crashed into the center of the music business, and the dinosaurs have definitely been obliterated. As digital technology advanced, the iPod, iPhone, Android, smartphone, iPad, PlayStation, Mbox, and all forms of tablets became the new ways to engage our leisure time. So the central position that music occupied in the 1950s onwards began to change, and it became just one of the many leisure activities from which we could choose our pastimes. In addition, the experience of music became less of a community activity and more of a solitary one. Beg your pardon. We stuffed our iPods into our ears and off we went into our own world. Our record collections changed from dog-eared shelves of vinyl or a tidy array of CDs into a library of thousands of recordings on our hard drive or in the cloud, most of which, when downloaded, hopefully legally, we would never listen to anyway. Our relationship to music became less discerning, more indiscriminate and promiscuous. What had been a passionate center of gravity had now become a casual, more peripheral activity. And yet, music was still everywhere. Of course, it had been used for advertising for many years, but now composers were making careers out of writing ringtones for telephones or music for computer games. And music on television served only as a vehicle for the hysterical antics of the so-called talent shows, where dubious judges gave cynical and often cruel pronouncements on the efforts of unfortunate wannabe singers. So here again, the emphasis had shifted. The stars were no longer the performers, but instead the self-promoting and often nauseating judges, many of whom could neither play an instrument nor hold a tune. The meteor had certainly caused us to shift the center of gravity. Years ago, when our family was young, we were in America. I took one of my daughters to a shop called Toys R Us. It was August, and Christmas was miles away. And yet here we were in a supermarket, twice the size of Dunn's, filled with nothing but toys. Nessa picked up a basket, and off we went down the aisles. The first toy that attracted her went into the basket, and so we continued our meanderings. Each time she found another toy, she put the first one back on the shelf. A nightmare, but for the stock takers. Anyway, by the time she got to the checkout, she had discarded about 20 toys and was now even having second thoughts about the one that remained in her hand. My point is this. We have now access to a cornucopia of music. Everything from 16th century Renaissance music to esoteric electronica and exotic tribal dance music from Amazonia. But finding our way through this Tower of Babel is very challenging. Yes, the technology is more than willing to help. If I like James Taylor, my software will guess that I like Don McLean. In fact, that might be wrong. However, what is now missing from my life completely is the relationship I used to have with the guy who owned a small jazz record store on Bagot Street. The proprietor was Joe Conway, and the shop was called Disc Finder. I went to Joe when I heard some track on the radio and wanted to find out more. And often, when I would be browsing the album sleeves in the cramped conditions of the shop, he would put on a record I'd never heard and smile as he saw my ears prick up. He knew what I liked, or he guessed what I might like. Then we would talk about upcoming gigs or shoot the musical breeze, and he would flag me if he heard of any musician coming to town that I'd be interested in. Sure, a lot of this information is available to me on Google or iTunes, but no matter how many algorithms we write into the software, we will never replace the essential human contact available to us through our mutual love of music. And so as we stand here at the gateway to Babylon, it is perhaps prudent to check in our bags and make sure that we're not leaving anything important behind. For musicians, it's worth making sure that we do not forget the stimulus to creativity and existential joy that performing with other musicians can bring. Being alone with your computer or your pencil is and always will be an essential part of the work, but we must remember to open the windows and let the air in from time to time. For writers, when we write a new piece, we don't just create a new work, we also create a right. No matter what happens with the internet, the acknowledgement and protection of that right is essential to our future, and any attempts to dilute it will not alone make an already precarious existence virtually impossible, but will do terminal damage to the cultural life of our community at large. As performers and artists, we would do well to remember that this is what we do. No matter how many people are trying to convince us to become entrepreneurs and merchandisers, we would do well to imagine what it might be like if the record company executives and managers started to write and perform the songs themselves. Not a pretty picture. Most of all, it takes time to reach any degree of excellence at what we do. If we believe in our talent, then that is what we should invest our precious time and energies in. As music users, it is worth remembering that the enjoyment of music together is fun, and also a very healthy human activity. It is not only stimulating and relaxing, but it can also teach us about each other, about our emotional responses and our sense of identity. It works best when we give it space and devote a certain amount of mindfulness to allow it to work. For broadcasters, I would suggest that the role of radio is more vital than ever. Its capacity to remain in the community focus for an exchange of ideas, news, and music is essential in a world where the global is smothering the local, and our sense of identity is struggling to assert itself. In this world, where everything is available, we will always need the mediator that we can trust, the DJ whose taste we admire, the programmer who shows good judgment, to help navigate us through these endless choices to find the elusive diamonds in the rough. As a culture and society, we have made extraordinary leaps in a very short time. In fact, I think that we humans are breathless in trying to keep up with the technology. For some of our activities, we have created more than we need, but we seem to convince ourselves that we require even more synth as well. I don't need 250,000 songs on my iPad. I do not need to be able to text, phone, email, podcast, take photos, make movies, pay my bills, friend someone, tweet about my progress in the rush hour, all at the one time and on the same device. And if I do, the day is long, and what will I do with the rest of it? And as a society that survives on increasing consumption, we should perhaps pause to ask ourselves, how much corporate presence do we really want in our lives, in our cultural lives? Sure, it's great if some company sponsors a performance or a concert. I would never have been able to record or make Riverdance had I not got some money from an insurance company. But to replace the earnings of performers with revenue from advertisers is for me a step too far, and to watch as parasitic operators on the internet benefit from the content created by unpaid creators is particularly galling. If all of this seems a little dark and dystopian view, it isn't. As I said at the beginning, I have always welcomed the new technology. But it took me a few years before I was able to wrestle that drum machine to the floor and get it to do what I wanted. I think there are major excitements and possibilities ahead, but I'm simply taking this opportunity to pause and consider the strengths of what we had and to suggest that we weave the best of those into the fabric of our future. And if the rights of composers and authors are properly protected in a community of attentive music users, then I would be inclined to echo the words of the Duke of Wellington, publish and or broadcast, and be damned. Thank you. If there's any demystification or abuse that needs to be hurled, now's the time. Anyone like to ask any questions about all of that or make some observations? Yes?
That was excellent. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I agree with almost everything you said, and the role of the man in all of his or her guises, I think, is really important. Just one thing that I challenge you on, that's the role of something like iTunes. Sorry, the role of iTunes, because I'm a lover of music, always have been, and since iTunes came along, I found I've been able to indulge my passion in music much more than I would have ever been able to do in the past. And I've discovered new music, and my repertoire of music is much broader, and I own more music than I would have in the past because of the way that allows you to interact and purchase music. So I believe that, you know, having that type of digital availability of music is a very positive thing for people who want to indulge their passion, who mightn't be able to have the opportunity to go to that local jazz record store that you spoke of. That's the only thing that I would just challenge.
Sure. Well, first of all, can I say thank you? If I gave the impression that I had something negative to say about iTunes, I didn't really mean to do that, because iTunes to me probably are one of the few, and the whole Steve Jobs approach to, you know, what went on with the relationship between, you know, what has become kind of broadcasters, in other words, the internet and the music users, has been perhaps the most principled. I think there's another debate, probably not for this room, about how well the negotiation has gone on there in terms of money making its way to the artist. That's another debate. But certainly I agree with you, absolutely. And you know, and I do want to make the point that I totally am a complete technophile, and I love it, and I use it all the time. But I am becoming aware, as I think, you know, a lot of people who work at what I do are becoming aware that actually, for instance, I have a son who's just graduated from Berklee School of Music in Boston. He's done 4 years there. He's a talented young musician. I don't actually know what to say to him about where to go. Because when I was starting off, I worked, you know, in RTE, and I didn't work for RTE, but I did contract work for RTE, and then there were the sessions that I spoke about. And there was all those kind of opportunities. All of that sort of thing has kind of virtually ceased. And, you know, RTE are no longer making the sort of entertainment programs that they used to make, where they employed musicians. You know, it's very, very difficult for a young musician to find his way, either A, to make his way to iTunes, or to make his or her way to an audience, to find that audience. And that's where radio has a real role, I think. You know, if you listen to your station and you know that so-and-so is going to play stuff that you like, well, then you trust them a little bit, because it's impossible. It's just not possible to get to it all. But there is that introductory thing that iTunes does, and Spotify and others, that introduce people to music and make some attempt to recompense the creators properly. But as I say, that's another debate. But I agree with you. Yeah, thank you. Anything? No one want to argue anything? No.
Well, I'll just say that, thank you for that.
Oh, there was one behind you. Sorry.
So the 25-year-old or whoever said there, just why you come up with my CD now, put the music that you get free onto it. How do you get them? I mean, obviously the radio station is great as a curator, as a one that developing separate music for young people. How do you get people to buy the actual music?
Well, unfortunately, you know, I think there is a legislative answer to this, and I think there's also a corporate responsibility answer to this. There's an ecological, cultural ecology that needs to be examined, and I think the legislators have to look at that. What are we losing? And some of the things I've referred to there, I think we are losing something important. We're losing something essentially human, and our relationships are starting to become totally mediated by a machine. You know, if I buy my books and then I'm told what the next books to buy are. There is something around it's not just the music, it's the cultural outflow from it all that I think we're missing. And I think I find, I just did a concert in Boston with a lot of young musicians, and the idealism in young musicians is still very, very much alive. But the thing I despair about is that if they're moving into a place that, as I said, is an economy without a currency, then it's very, very difficult. I think there has to be, unfortunately, some kind of a price paid to weed out the fact that lots of people are just throwing anything up there, as we know, and they should, of course, they should have a right to do that if they want. But we need to somehow or other, as a culture, make it easy for ourselves to find our way to what is of quality, and also to educate young people. And I think I'm more optimistic now than I was 10 years ago. I see it. I think that young people are now saying, I hear young kids that they do understand that there's a relationship between what they do in music and how they use it, and how, Beyonce makes a few bob, God love her. There is that connection starting to appear. And I think we just have to start saying it, sing it loud. That's the truth of it. The truth is that you can't expect people to, there's no other job in the world where we would have people standing up saying, do you know what, it's a fantastic thing. You can work for nothing now. It's great. It's not great to hear, is it? Unless you're going to support them by the state. So I think it is an educational issue. I think there is a willingness on the part of young people to realize the connection between music makers and their living. But it's just a matter of all of us and those of us who are in a position to say it. And artists, I saw a talk on the internet the other night with David Byrne of Talking Heads. And, he's one of the few artists to have come out about this. Artists are afraid, because they're afraid they're going to alienate their audience if they start saying, and people look at Bono and they say, Bono's looking for more money, for God's sake, forget it. But it's not, it's for the next generation. We're forgetting that we're putting money in the bank here, the bank of our own culture and the bank of our own creativity and ideas. And we have to support it, because the state's not going to do it. Sorry, long answer, but yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think it is. And I think, I remember when I first started to get uneasy about all of this, in the middle of buying myself another Mac and, another sampler and all that, I started to get uneasy about this. And I remember talking to my wife about it and saying, we really, and she said to me, nothing will happen until the film business gets hurt, because that's where the big bucks are. I mean, who cares if, Bill Whelan doesn't make a few bob this week, with his new song? Who cares? But when the film business, which is mega bucks, starts to hurt, and now the film business is hurting. People are downloading movies for nothing. Kids are telling me that they're looking at stuff that isn't even released yet. I mean, it's extraordinary what's going on. So that has to get, there is an element of sensible regulation here that's not, a complete denial of human freedom, but there is an element of sensible regulation that needs to be looked at. And I really believe that legislators need to get sensible about this. They're losing. We are losing. And I say this globally. It's the same in America. I mean, everyone's suffering. But artists have not spoken out traditionally because, as I said, they're afraid. Broadcasters, I don't know. Do broadcasters make a point of that? I think there's an argument here that needs to be made again and again in a positive way. Not, you can't do that. It's more, if you do this, then you're going to have that, But I think it's a shared problem, and I think radio, obviously, you feel it as well, so we have to work together, yeah.